Last time we discussed the foundations and the growth of the slave trade. Let's now take a deeper look at the key components of the slave trade, including the triangular trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas, the infamous Middle Passage, and the impact of the African slave trade both on the Americas and Africa. Finally, we'll look at the legacy of slavery. As you can see from this map depicting North and South America, Europe, and Africa, with the coasts highlighted, the slave trade was a critical component of what came to be known as the triangular trade, where West Africa, the Americas, and Europe formed the corners of a triangular trading network that became the basis of a new global interdependence. The first leg of the triangular trade was the trip from Europe to Africa. Europeans would arrive on the west coast of Africa with manufactured goods, clothing, and metalwares. Firearms and ammunition were also quite popular with African slavers, and silks from Asia established an economic link with the East. Europeans exchanged manufactured goods for slaves that had been kidnapped by native African tribes that specialized in going inland to enslave members of rival native tribes. Once kidnapped, the captors were forced marched to the West African coast and loaded onto sailing vessels. With the slaves on board, the second leg of the triangle commenced. The slave ships departing for the West Indies and the Americas. After crossing the Atlantic, the ships would arrive and the slaves would be sold, fetching a 200 to 300% profit for the slavers. Typically, slaves weren't sold for money or for cash. Instead, they were exchanged for raw materials such as sugar, molasses, rum, rice, coffee, tobacco, cotton, all products that were easily produced in the Americas, but which were difficult to grow in a much colder European climate and very much sought after by Europeans. The third leg of the voyage took the slave ships back to Europe. Loaded with raw materials, they set sail for ports and manufacturing centers where the raw materials could be consumed or turned into manufactured goods, which would then in turn go back onto a ship headed south to Africa, where the entire cycle began anew. For an African unfortunate enough to be captured and enslaved, the stretch of the voyage referred to as the Middle Passage was absolutely horrific. Depending on the winds, the trip lasted a month or longer, often stretching to 6 weeks. Enslaved Africans were subjected to excruciating conditions in cramped, filthy quarters with precious little to eat and drink. Many died on the journey. As you can see in this plan of a slave ship, slaves were forced to remain lying down next to each other for the entire trip. They weren't allowed to get up and walk around since they were usually chained together. Incredibly, their captors kept them stacked. So what you're seeing here is just one layer. The next layer typically would have been between 2 or 3 feet above the head, meaning they could not sit up comfortably. In this image, you can actually see the short distance between the floor and the next shelf. The mannequins in the image are in the position that slaves were forced to remain in for most of the trip. Since the slaves didn't have chamber pots or toilets, just a few hours after the trip commenced, the stench of urine and excrement pervaded the decks. On early slave ships, ventilation in the hold was virtually non-existent, which contributed to the spread of disease in these cramped quarters. On the rare occasions when slaves might be allowed to the top deck to get a breath of fresh air, they were closely watched, as slave traders feared that slaves might either jump off the ship into the sea or, worse yet, rebel. Initially, slavers didn't much care about the well-being of their human cargo. In the 1500s, Middle Passage death rates remained somewhere between 33 and 50%. As slave traders became more cognizant of the profit they were losing from the cargo dying, they took measures to improve the survival rate. This usually meant force-feeding slaves that were either too weak to feed themselves or refused to eat. With time, this elevated the survival rate to about 95% of the slaves that debarked from Africa. Overall, however, we calculate that about 4 million Africans died in the Middle Passage. This represents 25% of the total 16 million Africans brought over to the Americas in the 300 years the Atlantic slave trade endured. In America, slavery became the backbone of the continent's agricultural economies. It also established a very deep-seated racism and segregation of the different populations, the separation of African and Spanish and African and English. As we'll see later this semester, racism and segregation have proven to be abiding, often intractable practices. To this day, they remain difficult to redress throughout the Americas and the Caribbean. The effect of the slave trade on Africa was no less severe. Politically, tribes specializing in the capture and sale of slaves to Europeans enjoyed an increased influence. Demographically, African populations were depleted. Taken together, the Atlantic slave trade and the Islamic slave trade forcibly extracted around 26 million people from the African continent. The slave trade also affected gender relations within African societies because the sex ratios were left unbalanced. About 2/3 of the slaves were males between the ages of 14 and 35. Consequently, there were many more women than men left in Africa. In male-dominated societies, this led to polygamy and a significant increase in workload for women. Even though most European countries declared the slave trade illegal in the early 1800s, Africa would be left reeling from its effects well into the 19th century. And while slavery as an institution is gone, slavery as an economic practice is very much alive. We see elements of it that survive today in the use of children in clothing manufacturing sweatshops and brick-making factories and in the sex trade. Think about Southeast Asia, India, and Pakistan. Think about China. And yes, think about the Americas as well. So it's a long, troubling, and deeply immoral history. We need to acknowledge the slave trade for what it was and continues to be, a crime against humanity. As we move forward in this course, try to appreciate how the events of the past, even the darkest ones, can illuminate the complex and interconnected nature of the modern world. Try also to appreciate how important it is to discuss these difficult issues in a spirit of cooperation and collegiality. There's an African proverb that captures this perfectly. If you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Until next time, best wishes for a productive and far-reaching conversation.